The auction barn smelled like wet wool and diesel, and the misfit pen sat at the far end where Denny Kessler always put the lots nobody wanted to look at for long. Maren Holt had been coming to the Draper's Mill dispersal sale every October for 3 years, not to buy most years, but to watch the county sheep move through the ring and to keep a working sense of what things cost. She stood at the rail of the misfit pen a little after 9 in the morning, with her coffee going cold in her hand, and looked at 60 sheep who did not want to be looked at. They moved in a way that wasn't quite a flock. A flock holds together, drifts as one animal with 60 bodies. These sheep broke apart every time someone walked past the rail, scattered to the corners, regrouped wrong, broke apart again. A Cheviot Corriedale cross mostly, mixed in with a handful of something rangier that nobody in the barn could name with confidence. Kessler's catalog card just said non-uniform, prior handling issues, sold as one lot, no returns. Maren had heard why before she got to the rail. The outfit that ran them, a commercial operation 2 counties over, had worked them off four-wheelers with dogs that bit to move stock instead of dogs that read stock. And by the time the operation went under, the sheep flinched at anything that came at them fast, human or animal, and would not pen without a fight that cost more in vet bills and fence repair than the sheep were worth. 60 sheep that could not be gathered without chaos were 60 sheep nobody in a working operation had time for. She watched them for a while before she noticed the one that didn't move with the rest. A ewe near the back corner, older, heavier in the body than the others, who held her ground when the group broke and scattered, who watched the commotion with the settled attention of an animal that had already decided panic wasn't going to solve anything. Maren had learned a long time ago, from her husband, from years of her own sheep before that a flock that won't hold together sometimes has one animal in it who would hold it together if she had a chance to. She was still watching that ewe when a man's voice behind her said, "You're not thinking about that pen." She turned. Warren Iverson stood a few feet back, 70-some years old, a cattleman's hat and a shepherd's stoop, holding a leash that ran to a black and white border collie sitting very still at his knee. The dog's eyes had the flat blue-white cloud of cataracts gone all the way through, and he sat facing slightly off from where Warren stood, oriented not to the man but to something else. A sound or a scent Maren couldn't identify from where she stood. "I might be," Maren said. Warren looked at the pen. "Nobody's going to work that lot without a good dog and a lot of patience," he said. "And even then." Maren looked at the collie. "This the dog you're not taking home?" Warren was quiet a moment. "Scout's 13, he said. "Been blind going on 2 years now. My daughter's got me moving into town next month. And there's no place for a working dog in an apartment that can't work anyway." He said it flat. The way a man says a fact he has already grieved and doesn't need to grieve again in front of a stranger. "Nobody wants a dog that can't see," he said. "I've asked around." Scout sat at his knee, with his ears turned toward the misfit pen, toward the sound of 60 sheep breaking and regrouping wrong. And Maren watched something in the dog's posture that she filed away without being able to name it yet. An attention that had nothing to do with sight, and everything to do with reading a situation through whatever channels were still open to him. Hit the like button before you go further into this one. Tell me what state or country you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this travels. Now let's get into it. Maren Holt was 39 years old and had been running Holt Ridge Farm alone for 2 years, since the morning her husband Dell had taken the old tractor up the north pasture slope to move a round bale, and the tractor had gone over on the grade where the ground held more water than it looked like it did. Dell had been the one who understood sheep the way some people understand weather, by instinct built on decades rather than by anything he could have explained if you'd asked him to. He had also been the one with the dog, a red border collie named Tick, who worked the flock with an economy of movement that made the job look easy. and who had stopped eating within a week of Dell's funeral and was dead within 2 months of it, which the vet said happened sometimes with dogs bonded that tight to one person, and which Maren had not fully recovered from discussing even now. She had kept 12 ewes since then, the number she could manage by herself on foot, with a set of hurdles and more time than she wanted to spend on it. 12 ewes without a dog meant every gather was a slow, deliberate, 2-hour operation of patient walking and careful positioning, doable with 12 animals who knew her and knew the routine, impossible to scale past that number. Holt Ridge sat on 140 acres of Kettle County ridge and coulee land off Coon Hollow Road, land that had been sheep ground since Dell's grandfather ran the first flock on it in the 1950s, land that could carry considerably more than 12 ewes if Maren had any way to move them. She had thought about hiring help. She had thought about a new dog, a young one, and had gone as far as calling 2 breeders before deciding she did not have it in her yet to bond with and train a dog the way Dell had trained Tick, not this soon, not with what had happened to Tick fresh enough in her memory that the thought made her stomach tighten. She was known around Draper's mill as Dell Holt's widow first and a farmer second, a distinction that had less to do with what she actually did on the land, which was everything, and more to do with how a small county assigns identity to people it has known a long time and isn't in a hurry to revise. Some people added the word capable because she'd kept the place running without help through 2 winters that had put larger operations under. Some people added a quieter word, the one nobody said directly, the one that hung around anyone who'd lost a spouse young and stayed on the land anyway instead of selling it and starting over somewhere with less of him in it. Maren did not discuss the tractor, the grade, or the 8 minutes it had taken her to find him after she noticed he hadn't come back for the second bale. She discussed the fence line, the hay yield, and that October, the price of lamb, when she discussed anything at all, which by her own accounting was not often enough to worry anyone who didn't already know her well enough to worry regardless. She had come to the Draper's mill sale that October morning without a plan beyond watching the market and drinking bad coffee, and she left it 4 hours later, having bought 60 sheep nobody wanted and a 13-year-old blind dog nobody would take, for reasons she was still assembling into something she could say out loud if anyone asked her to. She asked Kessler what he'd take for the lot. He told her $40 a head was the going rate for sound stock that week, and this wasn't sound stock in the way the market meant it. So he'd take $3 a head for the 60 and call it a mercy to everyone in the building who didn't want to load them. Maren counted out $180. Kessler wrote the paperwork with the particular carefulness of a man documenting a decision he privately thought was a mistake but wasn't going to say so out loud to a widow buying sheep with her own money. Roy Pruitt, who ran 400 head of cattle east of Draper's mill and had been coming to Kessler's sale since before Maren was born, was standing near the coffee urn when the paperwork got written, and he watched her walk toward the misfit pen with the receipt in her hand, and he said to the man next to him, not quietly, "She bought the whole scatter lot, every one of them." The man next to him said, "What's she going to work them with?" Roy looked over at Warren Iverson, who was already walking toward Maren with Scout's leash in his hand, and Roy laughed once short. "That," he said. Loading took longer than it should have. The sheep bolted the ramp twice, scattered across the holding pen, had to be walked back and started again, and Warren stood at the rail the whole time not offering to help load, because helping wasn't really the thing he had left to offer. When the last one was in the trailer, he crouched down next to Scout and put both hands on the dog's head for a moment, not saying anything, and then he stood up and handed Maren the leash. "He knows come by and away to me," Warren said. "He knows lie down, and that'll do. He won't take a new command well at his age, so don't try to teach him anything new. He'll work off your voice and your whistle if you keep them exactly the way I taught them to him, and I'll write those down for you before you leave," Maren said. "What do I owe you for him?" Warren was quiet for a moment. $5, he said. "So it's a sale and not a charity, and neither one of us has to feel some way about it." She paid him the $5. She loaded Scout into the truck cab, where he sat oriented toward the trailer behind them, with his ears working the whole way home, tracking 60 sheep he could not see and had never smelled before that morning, cataloging something in a way Maren couldn't follow yet, but intended to learn to. The drive back to Holt Ridge took 40 minutes on county roads that curved along the base of the ridges, and Maren spent most of it doing math she should have done before the paperwork was signed. 60 sheep on a farm fenced for 12. A dog who couldn't see the fence lines, the gates, the flock, any of it. Feed she hadn't budgeted, hay she hadn't stacked, a fall shearing she now needed and hadn't scheduled, and a winter coming that Kettle County did not do gently. She had 140 acres and about 4 of them properly cross-fenced. She had a round pen behind the barn that Dell had built for working young stock, sound enough still, big enough for maybe 20 sheep at a squeeze. She did not have anywhere to safely hold 60 flighty sheep on the first night, and she knew it before she got home, and she spent the last 10 minutes of the drive deciding what she was going to do about it instead of whether she should have done this at all, because that decision was $3 a head and 5 more for the dog and already made. She got them into the round pen by dusk, all 60, with 2 escapes through a gap in the panel gate that took 20 minutes each to resolve, and left her hands shaking with adrenaline by the time the last one was back inside. Scout stayed at the fence the whole time, not working, just present, his head tracking the sound and movement on the other side of the panels with a stillness that Maren found, against all reason, calming to be near. She fed hay she hadn't planned to use that fast. She checked the panel gate twice before dark and once more by flashlight before she went inside. She sat at the kitchen table with a notebook that had mostly held feed orders and vet bills for 2 years and wrote at the top of a fresh page, 60 sheep, 1 dog. October 14th. Under it, she wrote what Warren had told her before she left the sale barn, in his handwriting on a torn sheet of notepaper she'd tucked into her coat pocket. Come by means go clockwise. Away means go counter. Lie down means stop and drop. That'll do means quit and come to me. He won't take a new whistle. Use these 4 exactly. Word moved through Draper's mill the way it always did, which was faster than seemed physically possible for a county with this much empty space in it. She heard it firsthand 3 days later at Sachs Farm and Feed, where she'd gone for a second round of hay twine and a bag of mineral blocks she hadn't budgeted for either. Arlen Sachs had run the feed store for going on 20 years and had a way of ringing up a purchase while conducting a conversation that made it hard to tell which one had his full attention. "Heard you bought Kessler's whole scatter pen," he said, "and Warren's dog." Maren said, "I did." Arlen said, "The blind one." Maren said, "That's the one he had." Arlen rang up the mineral block. He said, "You know, a working dog needs eyes for this kind of ground. Coolies brush 60 head that won't hold a line." Maren said, "I know that's what everyone thinks." Arlen looked at her for a second longer than the transaction required. He said, "You got a plan for him?" Maren said, "I'm working on one." She paid and left, and she was aware, the way she'd been aware of most things in this county for 2 years, that the conversation would continue after she was out the door, and that it would probably run for a while. She called the county extension office that same week and got a sheep specialist named Denise Ott on the phone, a woman who had spent 30 years fielding questions that ranged from routine to strange, and did not seem to find Maren's especially strange by comparison. Maren described the flock, the handling history, the flightiness, and Denise told her something Maren had half suspected and hadn't had the vocabulary for. Sheep that have been worked hard by aggressive dogs and fast machinery build an association between direct, fast, forward pressure and danger, Denise said, and a sighted dog working the traditional way, using what shepherds call the eye, a locked predatory stare that pressures a flock to move away from it, can trigger exactly the panic response those sheep are primed for, because the eye is functionally the same signal the aggressive dogs gave them right before things got rough. Maren asked what that meant for a dog that couldn't give the eye at all. Denise was quiet on the line for a moment. "I've heard of blind stock dogs working," she said. "Not many. The ones that do tend to work slower, wider, and closer to the ground with sound and scent instead of a stare. And I've heard secondhand that traumatized stock sometimes settles better for a dog that isn't pressuring them the way the animal in their memory did. I've never seen it myself. I wouldn't rule it out, and I wouldn't count on it either." Maren wrote all of it down. Denise Ott drove out from the extension office the following week. On her own time, she said, because she'd been thinking about the phone call since Maren hung up and wanted to see it for herself before she said anything further to anyone else about it. She stood at the round pen fence in a canvas coat with a clipboard she didn't end up using much, and she watched Scout for the better part of an hour without saying anything, the way a person watches something they are trying not to form an opinion about too early. She asked Maren to run him through the 4 commands with no sheep in the pen at all, just to see his body and his responses clean. "Come by." Scout rose and moved. "Away to me," he reversed. "Lie down." He dropped where he stood. "That'll do." He came to Maren's leg and sat. Denise watched all of it and said, "His conditioning's intact." That's not nothing at 13, blind 2 years. A lot of dogs lose the muscle memory when the sense that used to trigger it goes. Maren said Warren kept working him on lead after his seat went, short sessions, just to keep him sharp, even after he couldn't use him on stock anymore. Denise said, "That's why he's got something to build from. A dog that stopped working the day he went blind wouldn't have this." She watched Scout a while longer. She said, "I want to come back after you've got him on stock a few weeks. I'd like to write this up, if you're willing, for the extension bulletin. Not because it's typical, because it isn't, and people ought to know it's possible before they make a decision about a dog based on what he can't do instead of what he still can." Maren said she was willing. Denise left her card on the porch rail and drove back toward town, and Maren stood at the pen a while longer, thinking about the phrase Denise had used, built from instead of started over, and finding that she preferred it to anything she'd have come up with on her own. She started with Scout in the round pen with 3 sheep, not 60. The calmest 3 she could identify, the old ewe from the misfit pen included, on the theory that if this was going to fail, it should fail small. She used the 4 commands exactly as Warren had written them, in the same tone Warren had presumably used for 13 years, and for the first 4 days, Scout did almost nothing that looked like work. He located the sheep by ear and by scent, oriented himself to their position, and then held still, which Maren's notebook recorded flatly and without editorializing because she did not yet know if stillness was progress or failure. Day 1, no response to come by. Day 2, ears tracked movement, no body movement. Day 3, same. Day 4, on a repeated command, a single step, correct direction. She almost missed it. It was 1 step, off a dog who had once worked 400 ewes a day for a man who trusted him with everything, and it was the first thing that had gone right since the auction, so she wrote it down twice. The flock, meanwhile, was testing every seam in fencing that had been adequate for 12 sheep and was not adequate for 60. 2 ewes went through a low spot in the perimeter wire on the 18th of October and were found a mile down Coon Hollow Road by a neighbor who called it in before Maren had finished counting heads to notice they were gone. One of the two had cut a leg badly enough on a fence stub during the escape that the vet recommended culling her rather than treating a wound that would likely reopen on ground this rough, and Maren processed her rather than lose the investment entirely. 59 remained. On the night of October the 26th, with the perimeter fence still only half reinforced, something took a U from the flock's edge sometime after midnight, and what was left in the morning told Maren it had been coyotes rather than anything that left the carcass intact. 58 remained. She wrote both losses in the notebook without comment beyond the date and the count, the way she'd learned, from nowhere in particular, that you record what happened and you keep the number current, because a farm that lies to itself about its numbers doesn't stay a farm for long. She had priced the fencing before she bought the sheep, or thought she had, back when she'd budgeted for 12 animals and a perimeter that mostly needed patching rather than rebuilding. 60 animals with a documented tendency to run through anything that meant patching wasn't going to hold, and she spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table with a legal pad figuring out how much wire, how many posts, how many insulators, and what it would cost against what she had left after the auction and the winter hay order. The number came to just under $1,100, which she did not have sitting free, and which she covered by selling 4 of Dell's old implements out of the machine shed that she'd been meaning to sell for 2 years anyway, and had kept putting off for reasons that had more to do with not wanting to walk into that shed than with needing the equipment. She sold a disc harrow, a hay rake, and 2 implements she couldn't remember the last time either of them had used, to a neighbor 3 farms up who paid cash and hauled them out on a flatbed on a Saturday morning, while Maren stood at the fence line with Scout and did not watch the trailer pull out of the drive until it was most of the way down the road. She finished the cross fencing in the first week of November, 4 strands of high-tensile wire, dividing the flat pasture below the ridge into paddocks small enough to rotate and secure enough to hold. Work that took her 6 days of driving posts and stretching wire by herself in weather that had turned from cool to genuinely cold. Scout worked the 3 sheep group daily through that period, and the notebook tracked him the way it tracked the fence losses, plainly, 1 line at a time. Day 9, first clean come by. Sheep moved 8 feet, correct direction, no panic. Day 14, worked all 3 sheep from one end of round pen to other, held them at gate, first time. Day 19, added 2 more sheep to the working group, no disruption to established behavior. Day 23, worked 5 sheep through a gate transition for the first time. She ran into Roy Pruitt at the co-op on a Tuesday in the middle of this stretch, buying block salt he didn't strictly need, in the way men in Kettle County sometimes bought things they didn't need as an excuse to be somewhere conversation happened. He said, "Here you got a blind dog moving sheep now." Maren said, "Some of them, 5 at a time so far." Roy said, "Out of 60. Maren said, "Out of 60. He said, "How's a dog that can't see know where the fence is, where the gate is, where the sheep have got to?" Maren thought about how Denise Ott had explained it to her, and decided the short version was the honest one. "He doesn't work off-site," she said. "Never did, not for 2 years. He works off where the sound is and where the smell is, and it turns out for these particular sheep, that might be easier to trust than a dog staring them down the way the last outfit's dogs did." Roy was quiet for a second. He said, "Huh." It was the same sound Maren had heard from more than one person in the county that fall, the specific noise people make when a piece of information has arrived faster than their opinion was ready to update, and she had started to recognize it as a kind of progress in its own right, even when it wasn't accompanied by anything more generous. She saw Arlen Sachs's wife, Connie, at the grocery in town during that stretch, and Connie, who ran the church prayer chain and therefore functioned as a kind of secondary news service for the county, asked her directly how the dog was coming along, in the tone of a woman who had already heard 3 different versions and wanted the real one. Maren told her about the single step on day 4, the clean gather of 5 sheep by day 23. Careful to give numbers instead of impressions, because numbers were harder to distort in the retelling, Connie said. Arlen, said Roy Pruitt, still thinks you're going to lose the whole flock before spring. Maren said, Roy's entitled to think that. Connie said, I told him a dog that can work 5 out of 60 in 3 weeks, starting from nothing, is going to work 60 out of 60 by spring, and he didn't have much to say back. She said it with the satisfaction of a woman who enjoyed being proven right in advance, and Maren thanked her for the vote of confidence, and did not mention that she wasn't entirely certain of it herself yet. By the 3rd week of November, Scout was working groups of 10 without hesitation, moving them at a slower pace than a sighted dog would have, wide and low, circling out further, before closing than the textbook diagrams called for. And Maren watched him do it and understood, without anyone needing to explain it to her again, exactly what Denise Ott had described on the phone. He never stared them down because he couldn't. He pressured them by sound, by the soft, steady click of his approach and the low arc of his circling, and the flock that flinched from anything fast or direct had nothing in Scout's approach that matched what had hurt them before. They moved for him not because he was easier to ignore, but because he never gave them a reason to bolt. The full test came on December the 2nd, a cold, still morning, when Maren decided to see what would happen if she asked Scout to gather all 58 at once from the back pasture and bring them down to the paddock nearest the barn. She had rehearsed the moment in her head enough times that she almost talked herself out of trying it, on the theory that failure with the whole flock would set them back further than success with small groups was worth. She tried it anyway. She sent Scout out on a wide away to me, wider than she would have sent a sighted dog, and watched him work the perimeter of 58 sheep with his head low and his pace unhurried, and watched the flock, instead of breaking into the panic scatter that had defined every gather since the auction, begin to draw together into something that finally, for the first time since she'd bought them, looked like a single moving animal instead of 60 separate ones deciding independently whether to run. It took 40 minutes. It should have taken 15 with a young dog on sound stock, and it was still the best 40 minutes Maren had spent on that farm since Dell died, because at the end of it, 58 sheep stood calm and held in the paddock nearest the barn, and a 13-year-old blind dog lay down at the gate the way Warren had told her he would when the job was done, and waited to be told that'll do. She wrote in the notebook that night, December 2nd, full gather, 58 head, 1 dog, 40 minutes, no panic, no escape, started at 60. Lost 2 to fence and 1 to coyote. 58 remain, and 58 held today for the first time like a flock instead of a scatter. She sat with that for a while before she added the last line, he can't see them, he never could. He worked them anyway, and it worked better than sight would have. She looked at that sentence longer than she looked at any of the others, and she did not write anything under it, because she was not entirely sure yet what to do with it beyond letting it be true. Winter went the way winter goes in Kettle County, which was to say slowly and mostly indoors, with the flock held on stockpiled pasture and supplemental hay through the worst of it, and Scout working small daily moves that kept both the sheep and the dog in practice without asking either of them for more than the season could support. Maren bred 45 of the 47 ewes in the flock to a ram she bought in December from a breeder 2 counties south, a sound Corriedale Cross ram with good conformation and no history of the kind of handling that had wrecked the rest of the flock's nerves, and she held back the 2 youngest ewes as too small for their first breeding season. She sheared the flock in late February, 58 fleeces off animals that had never been sheared calmly before, Done over 3 days, with Scout holding small groups steady in the shearing shed while Maren and a hired shearer worked through them, and what came off the sheep surprised her. The wool wasn't uniform, because the flock wasn't a uniform breed to begin with, but it was fine in places and long stapled in others, and had a range of natural color, cream through gray, through a deep brown on 4 of the Ranger ewes, that a commercial buyer paying by uniform bulk weight would never have valued, and a hand spinner or a small mill sorting for character absolutely would. Lambing started the first week of April, and it was the first lambing Maren had run at this scale, 45 ewes against the 12 she'd managed alone in each of the previous 2 springs, and she had spent March preparing for it the way she prepared for everything now, methodically, with a notebook page for supplies and a second page for the schedule of night checks she'd need to run once the bulk of the ewes got close. She slept in the barn office on a cot for 11 nights, running in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of April, waking every 2 hours to walk the lambing pens with a flashlight, and Scout, too old by then to be much use at 3 in the morning, slept at the foot of the cot anyway, and got up every time she did, out of habit or loyalty or both, and walked the pens beside her without being asked. 45 ewes lambed across 3 weeks, and the notebook filled with the same flat, careful numbers it had carried all winter. 58 lambs born through the first 2 weeks, 5 lost, 2 to a difficult presentation Maren couldn't resolve in time, despite pulling one of them herself at 2 in the morning, with her arm in up to the shoulder and the ewe's breath fogging against her face in the cold barn air, and 3 to the cold snap that hit the 2nd week and took every farm in the county by surprise, killing newborn lambs in barns better prepared than Maren's before anyone could get heat lamps rigged fast enough. 53 lambs stood in the paddocks by the last week of April, healthy, curious, unbothered by a dog they'd been raised around from birth and had never learned to fear, because Scout had never given them any reason to. She watched them from the porch some evenings, 53 lambs moving in the loose, directionless bounce that lambs move in before they've learned what a flock is for, and thought about the fact that not one of them would ever know the sheep, their mothers, had been the previous October, flighty and fractured, and worked half to panic by machines that came at them too fast. They would only know this ground, this rhythm, this dog, and whatever flock they grew into would carry forward from that instead of from what had come before it. 58 adults, 53 lambs. 111 sheep on a farm that had carried 12 2 years earlier, moved daily, gathered weekly, worked without panic, by a 13-year-old dog who could not see a single one of them. The wool buyer came in May. Her name was Nadine Farrow, and she sourced fiber for a regional mill that specialized in small batch, traceable wool for hand knitters and weavers who paid attention to where their yarn came from and what the animal's life had looked like. She had heard about Holt Ridge from a Fiber Guild member who'd heard about it from Arlen Sachs's wife, who had heard the whole story secondhand at church and repeated it with enough color that it had traveled the length of the county inside of a month. Nadine walked the paddocks with a notebook of her own and asked the kind of specific questions Maren had come to recognize from Denise Ott's calls, about fleece condition, about handling stress, about consistency of care. She watched Scout move a group of 20 ewes across the lower paddock while she talked, low and slow and wide, and she stopped mid-sentence to watch the whole thing finish. "That dog's blind," she said. Maren said. 13 years old, blind about 2 of them, Nadine said. "And he works them like that," Maren said. "He works them better than a sighted dog would. These particular sheep came in traumatized by aggressive handling. A dog that can't stare them down doesn't trigger what they're afraid of." Nadine wrote something down. She said, "That's a sourcing story," Maren said. "It's an accurate one." Nadine said, "The wool tells the same story if you look at it right. Uneven, high-character fiber-off animals nobody thought were worth the trouble, handled gentle enough that the fleece doesn't carry stress breaks in the staple. She looked at the paddocks again. She said, "I'd like to contract your clip. Guaranteed price, graded by lot instead of averaged, and I'd like to use the story if you're willing, the auction, the dog, all of it." People pay attention to where things come from when the story is true and the wool backs it up. Maren asked what graded by lot meant against a guarantee, since she'd only ever sold into a pooled commercial clip before, where every fleece got averaged into one flat price regardless of quality. Nadine explained it plainly, laying it out the way Marcus Dent might have laid out volume terms to anyone willing to listen carefully. The cream and gray fleeces off the 4 Ranger ewes graded highest and would be sold separately to hand spinners at triple the pooled rate. The bulk of the clip would go into a blended regional yarn line at a price still well above commercial pooling, and Nadine wanted first right of refusal on next year's clip written into the agreement now. Before another mill heard the story and came asking, Maren asked what happened if the flock's numbers changed year to year, since she was already thinking about buying another cull lot the following fall if this one worked. Nadine said the contract could scale with headcount as long as the handling stayed consistent, gentle, low stress, documented, and said that if Maren kept doing what she'd already done, sourcing sheep other people wrote off and working them without frightening them, the story would only get better with time instead of wearing thin the way novelty sourcing stories usually did. Maren said she'd need to think about the number, and Nadine said she could take a week, and by the time she drove off, Maren had a letter of intent on the kitchen table for 111 sheep's worth of a story that had started with $3 a head and a dog nobody would take for free. She ran into Roy Pruitt again at the co-op in June, buying salt he still didn't need. He said, "Heard you signed a wool contract." Maren said, "Word travels." He said, "The whole flock, all 100 and some of them." Maren said, 111 as of last count. He was quiet a second. He said, "I watched you buy that lot at Kessler's. Watched you take the dog, too. I thought you'd bought yourself a mess you weren't going to be able to move without a real dog." Maren said, "I know what you thought." He said, "I was wrong about the dog." Maren said, "Everybody was wrong about the dog. He worked from what he had left instead of what he'd lost. And it turned out what he had left was enough, more than enough, for animals that needed exactly what he could give them and nothing they were afraid of." Roy nodded slowly, the way men in Kettle County nodded when they'd revised an opinion and weren't going to make a speech about it. Arlen Sachs, ringing up the salt, said without looking up, "My grandfather ran sheep with a one-eyed dog for 6 years. Said the dog worked fine, just had a blind side you had to remember when you sent him out. Never thought about the other end of that. A dog with no sides working at all." Maren said, "There's more than one way to read a flock." Arlen was quiet a moment, tallying the receipt. Then he said, "You know what my grandfather's always told me about a new flock? Any flock, sheep, cattle, didn't matter." Maren said she didn't. He said the first month tells you whether you're going to lose them to the ground, the fences, the weather, all the ordinary ways a new lot gets thinned before it settles. He said that's not the month that decides anything, though. That's just the month that finds out who's left. Maren said, "What's the deciding month, then?" Arlen said, "The one where you've already lost what you're going to lose, and the animals that are left are looking at you to see if you're going to keep showing up the same way every single day regardless." He said, "Sheep learn a person's rhythm before they learn to trust it, and the deciding month is the one where the rhythm either holds or it doesn't." Maren thought about December, the 4-degree mornings, the small daily moves that hadn't asked anything dramatic of Scout or the flock, just showing up every day at the same hour in the same order. She said, "December," Arlen said. "There you go." He handed her the receipt. Warren Iverson came out to see the farm in June, driven by his daughter, who waited in the car reading a magazine while Warren walked the fence line with a cane he clearly resented needing. He stood at the paddock gate and watched Scout gather 20 ewes and their lambs across the lower field, low and slow and wide the way he'd worked for 13 years, and Warren didn't say anything for the whole of it. Just watched, the same stillness Maren remembered from the auction barn rail. When Scout brought the group to the gate and dropped at Maren's signal, Warren crouched down slowly, his knees clearly objecting to the movement, and put both hands on the dog's head the way he had the day he handed over the leash. Scout's tail moved against the ground, slow and steady, recognition arriving through scent before anything else could have told him who was there. "I told you not to teach him anything new," Warren said. Not looking up, Maren said, "I didn't. He already knew how to do this. He just needed sheep who'd let him." Warren was quiet a moment, still crouched, still with his hands on the dog. "I thought I was giving away a retired dog," he said. "Man at my age thinks a lot of things are retired that maybe just haven't been asked the right question yet." He stood up, slower than he'd crouched down, and looked out at the paddocks, at 111 sheep grazing on ground that had carried 12 the year before. "Dell would have liked this," he said. It wasn't a question, and Maren didn't treat it like one. She said, "I think he would have." Warren nodded once, the way men in Kettle County nodded when they meant something they weren't going to say a second way. He got back in the car with his daughter, and before they pulled out, he rolled the window down and said, "Send me word when he goes. I'd want to know." Maren said she would. She stood at the gate long after the car had turned onto Coon Hollow Road, Scout leaning against her leg, and thought about how many people in this county had, in one form or another, told her what she'd bought that October morning was already finished, and how few of them had been talking about the sheep at all when they said it. By the end of that first summer, Scout had slowed. He was 14 by then, moving stiffer in the mornings, needing longer rests between gathers, and Maren adjusted his workload the way she'd adjust for any aging working animal, fewer full flock moves, more small group work, more afternoons where he lay in the shade of the barn while she handled the routine chores herself. She had started, without entirely deciding to, training a young dog alongside him, a rescue border collie cross named Wren, who watched Scout work from the fence line the way an apprentice watches a master, and who Maren suspected, though she hadn't tested it yet, might learn something from a dog who worked by sound and patience that a sighted trainer wouldn't have thought to teach on purpose. She had picked Wren up from a shelter 2 counties north in July, a dog with full sight and no working history, restless in the way young border collies get when nobody has given them a job yet. And instead of starting her the conventional way with the eye, the stare, the forward pressure most training guides opened with, Maren found herself starting Wren the way Scout had been forced to relearn everything. Low, slow, off the whistle, and the voice first, sight held back as a second tool instead of the first one reached for. It was an accident of circumstance more than a plan, born mostly from watching Scout work all spring and unconsciously absorbing his rhythm before she'd decided to teach it on purpose. But by August she noticed that Wren, sighted, young, entirely capable of the traditional method, moved sheep with a softness that dogs trained the traditional way from day one rarely showed this early, and she wrote in the notebook, half a question and half a note to herself, that maybe the lesson from a blind dog wasn't only useful for blind dogs, that maybe pressure a flock could trust was worth building on purpose in any dog, sight or no sight, if you were willing to slow down enough to teach it that way. She wrote in the notebook, on the first anniversary of the sale, October the 14th, a full year to the day, started with 60 sheep and 1 blind dog nobody wanted, lost 3 head to fence and coyote in the first month, 58 held through winter, 53 lambs in spring, 111 sheep on the ground today. Wool contracted through a regional mill, and Scout, 14 years old now, still working slower, still reading a flock better than most dogs with 2 working eyes ever will, because he learned a long time ago to read what's actually there instead of what he expected to see. She looked at that last line for a while. Then she closed the notebook, put it on the shelf with the others. Next to Dell's old feed ledgers she had never gotten around to throwing out, and had started, this past year, to think of less as unfinished business and more as the first volumes in a set she was still adding to. She went out to check the fence line before dark, Scout at her heel, moving the way he always moved now, sure of the ground, because he had walked it enough times to know it without needing to see it at all, and Wren ranging ahead of them both, young and sighted, and still learning, in her own time on her own ground, the same patient rhythm the old dog had taught her, without either of them meaning to call it teaching. If this one landed with you, send it to someone who's ever been written off for what they'd lost instead of what they still had to give. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever bet on something everyone else had already decided was finished, I want to hear what it turned into.